The alarms on Station Kestrel were already screaming when I opened my eyes. Red light poured through the narrow window of my quarters, painting the walls the color of a warning nobody wanted to hear. I grabbed my jacket, my boots, and my sidearm in one motion, the way years of training had carved into my bones. Somewhere above us, in the black silence of space, something enormous had just entered the system, and it was not one of ours. My name is Daniel Hart, and I was the ranking officer on the smallest, most forgettable outpost humanity had ever built at the edge of known space. Kestrel was a mining relay, nothing more. 300 people, a handful of shuttles, and enough supplies to last a winter that never came, because Kestrel didn't have winters. It had silence, endless work, and a view of stars that never blinked. That silence ended the moment the fleet arrived. I ran through the corridor toward the command deck, boots slamming against metal grates, while crew members pressed themselves against the walls to let me pass. On the main screen, when I finally reached it, I saw them. Ships shaped like folded blades, dark and smooth, arranged in a formation that looked less like an approach and more like a noose tightening around our small station. "Identify," I said, though some part of me already knew this wasn't a rescue mission. Our systems officer, a young man named Oliver Finch, looked up at me with wide eyes. "They're broadcasting on an open channel, sir. It's the Korath Dominion." I had heard the name before, in briefings nobody took seriously, the kind of intelligence report that gets filed and forgotten. The Korath were one of the older powers among the stars, a coalition of species who had spent centuries absorbing smaller worlds into their empire, not through friendship, but through overwhelming force and the quiet threat of what would happen if you said no. The channel opened on its own, and a voice came through, calm and layered, as if several throats were speaking in perfect unison. "People of Kestrel, your colony now falls within the jurisdiction of the Korath Dominion. Submit your resources, your records, and your command structure, and no harm will come to you. Refuse, and we will remove the obstacle." I felt the room go still. 300 people, none of them soldiers, most of them engineers and miners who had never held a weapon in their lives, looked to me for an answer. I thought about the old story then, the one every child in the colonies grew up hearing, though nobody quite believed it was true. Long before humanity ever left its own solar system, the first explorers who ventured into deep space found ruins, ancient structures, untouched for longer than our written history, carved by no species anyone could identify. Buried in the stone of those ruins was a single phrase, translated slowly over decades by the small number of species who could even attempt it. "Do not provoke the ones who bury their dead and still remember them." Nobody knew who wrote it, or why, or what species it was even warning about. For a long time, most assumed it referred to some vanished empire, long extinct, a fossil of a threat that no longer existed. It became a myth, something scholars debated over drinks, a curiosity rather than a warning anyone acted on. Until humanity arrived among the stars, and the older species began to notice something strange about us. We did not act like the others. Every other species that had joined the wider galactic community had done so gradually, guided by more advanced powers, taught how to behave, shown their place in a long-established order. Humanity had none of that. We arrived loud, curious, and completely unwilling to be told where we belonged. The Korath, like many empires before them, looked at our history and saw exactly what they expected to see. Centuries of conflict among ourselves, cities built and destroyed and rebuilt, entire generations spent fighting wars that seemed to accomplish nothing except more war. To an outside observer, it looked like proof of instability, proof that humanity was young, disorganized, and ruled by emotion rather than strategy. What they did not understand, what none of them ever seemed to understand, was that every single one of those conflicts had taught us something. We did not simply fight, we adapted, we rebuilt faster after every collapse, we turned tragedy into invention, grief into unity, and defeat into the fuel for the next attempt. It was written into every part of our history, if anyone had cared to read it properly instead of skimming for weaknesses. The Korath did not read it properly. They saw a young species spread thin across a handful of colonies, defending outposts with civilian crews and outdated weapons. They saw an opportunity. On the command deck of Kestrel, I opened the return channel. "This is Commander Daniel Hart, acting authority for Station Kestrel," I said, keeping my voice level even as my hands were not quite steady. "This station operates under the protection and law of Earth and its colonies. We do not recognize your jurisdiction." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I wondered if the message had even been understood. "You are outnumbered," the voice replied. "You are unarmed in any meaningful sense. Your defiance changes nothing except the outcome for your people." "Maybe," I said, "but it changes what kind of people we are when it happens." The channel closed without another word. I turned to my crew, all of them watching me, waiting for orders I did not yet fully have. Oliver Finch was still at his console, his fingers hovering over controls meant for scanning asteroid fields, not tracking incoming warships. Beside him stood Grace Bennett, our station's chief engineer, arms crossed, jaw tight, refusing to let her fear show even though I could see it in the way her knuckles had gone pale. "What do we do?" Grace asked quietly. I looked at the screen, at the dark shapes drifting closer, patient and certain of their victory. "We remember who we are," I said, "and we make sure they remember it too." I did not know, in that moment, that the ancient warning carved into forgotten ruins was about to be proven true, not through some grand act of aggression on our part, but through the simple, unshakable fact that humanity, even at our smallest and most unprepared, refuses to disappear quietly. The Korath commander, a being named Voss Karen, watched the exchange from the bridge of the lead ship with something close to amusement. Voss had conquered 11 worlds in a long and celebrated career, and none of them had ever spoken to the Dominion the way this small, insignificant human commander just had. Voss ordered a single strike craft forward, a show of force meant to end the conversation before it began. It was meant to be a demonstration, not a battle, a reminder of scale, of power, of the impossible gap between an ancient empire and a colony that had only existed among the stars for a few short generations. What Voss did not know, what the entire Dominion did not know, was that the ancient warning had never been about weapons, or numbers, or the size of a fleet. It had been about what happens when you push a species that refuses, on a level deeper than strategy or reason, to ever stop fighting for what it loves. On Kestrel, as the first strike craft broke formation and began its descent toward our station, I gathered every able body I had, miners who knew how to handle heavy equipment, engineers who understood every wire and reactor core in the station better than any outsider ever could, ordinary people who, an hour earlier, had been sleeping, eating breakfast, living lives that had nothing to do with war. I looked at their faces, saw the fear there, and did not try to pretend it away. "I won't lie to you," I said. "This is not a fight we were built for. But it is a fight we are going to have, whether we choose it or not, so we choose how we meet it." Grace stepped forward first, already listing off which systems could be rerouted, which tools could become something other than what they were designed for. Oliver followed, his voice steadier now that he had something to focus on besides fear. One by one, the others joined in, voices overlapping, plans forming out of nothing but will and the refusal to simply wait for whatever the Dominion had decided our fate would be. Far above, Voss Karen leaned back in the command chair of the flagship, watching sensor readings that showed nothing more than a handful of humans scrambling to reinforce a station with no true defenses. It looked, from where Voss sat, like the final motions of a species already beaten. It would not take long, Voss thought, to prove the old warning nothing more than superstition. That thought would not survive the day. Somewhere in the depths of Station Kestrel, the reactor core hummed louder than it ever had before, as Grace Bennett rerouted power through systems that were never meant to hold a defense, and Oliver Finch fed coordinates into weapons that had spent years doing nothing but mapping rock and ice. Around them, ordinary people who had never imagined themselves as anything but engineers and miners became, in the space of a single hour, something the Korath Dominion had never accounted for. I stood at the center of it all, watching the strike craft descend on our sensors, and felt something settle in my chest that was not quite fear anymore. It was resolve. And resolve, as the ancient ruins had tried to warn every species wise enough to listen, was the one thing humanity had never been willing to surrender. The first impact came without warning, a tremor that rippled through the station's outer hull as the Korath strike craft opened fire on our docking bay, testing our defenses the way a predator tests the strength of a fence before deciding whether it is worth the trouble of breaking through. Alarms shifted from a distant warning to an immediate demand, and the calm that had settled over the command deck cracked into something sharper, more urgent. I gripped the edge of the console, feeling the floor shudder beneath my boots, and looked toward Grace, whose eyes had already found mine across the chaos. "Hull integrity holding," she called out, though the strain in her voice told me it would not hold forever. "They're not using full force. This is a test." "Then let's give them something to actually worry about," I said. Oliver's hands moved fast across controls that had never been built for combat, adjusting the trajectory of our mining lasers, weapons designed to cut through asteroid rock, now aimed instead at a ship built for war. It should not have worked. By every calculation the Korath had likely run before arriving, it should not have even scratched their hull. But when Oliver fired, the beam struck true, and for the first time since the Dominion ships had entered our system, I saw something on the enemy strike craft flicker and falter. A cheer rose from the crew, small and disbelieving, cut short by the sound of another impact against our hull, harder this time, an answer rather than a test. Voss Karen, watching from the flagship above, felt the first thread of confusion pull at otherwise perfect calculations. The station below was not behaving the way conquered worlds were supposed to behave. There was no panic in their transmissions, no offers of surrender, no desperate pleas for mercy, only coordinated defiance, growing sharper with every passing minute instead of collapsing under pressure the way every strategic model insisted it should. It was, Voss thought, an anomaly, nothing more. The order came down to increase the intensity of the assault. On Kestrel, the tremors grew worse, systems flickering, lights dimming, as power was rerouted again and again to whatever needed it most in that exact moment. I moved through the station, checking on crew members stationed at makeshift defense posts, offering words that were as much for my own steadiness as theirs. I found Grace near the reactor core, sweat on her brow, hands steady despite the chaos around her. "We can't hold this power output much longer," she said, "not without risking a cascade failure. How long do we need?" She looked at me, and in that look was every calculation she had already run in her head. Long enough to matter. I nodded, because that was the only answer either of us needed. Above the station, the Korath strike craft regrouped for a heavier assault, confident that whatever resistance they had encountered was a fluke, a momentary irregularity soon to be corrected. Voss issued the order personally this time, unwilling to let a colony as insignificant as Kestrel embarrass the Dominion's reputation among the wider galactic community that was, even now, watching how this conflict unfolded. What Voss did not yet understand was that humanity's history was not a record of embarrassment waiting to be corrected. It was a record of exactly this moment, over and over again, throughout every era of our existence. A moment where we are pushed to the edge of what should be possible, and instead of breaking, we simply become more than we were the moment before. The second wave of strike craft descended, weapons bright against the dark of space, and Kestrel's defenses answered with everything we had, jury-rigged systems and unshaken will standing against a war machine built to crush far larger worlds without effort. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, that machine hesitated. And somewhere among the stars, in ruins untouched for longer than history itself, The ancient warning waited patiently to be understood. By the third hour of the assault, Station Kestrel should have already fallen. Every projection Voskaren had run before arriving in our system said as much. A civilian outpost, lightly staffed, defended by mining equipment repurposed in desperation, could not withstand a coordinated strike from Dominion forces for more than a matter of minutes. Yet 3 hours had passed, and Kestrel still answered every attack with another act of defiance. I stood at the command console with blood on my sleeve from a cut I did not remember getting, watching Grace direct emergency repairs through a headset while half the reactor deck fought fires that had started from overloaded systems. Oliver had not left his post once, his eyes red from exhaustion, still tracking the movement of every strike craft the Dominion sent against us. "They're pulling back," Oliver said suddenly, disbelief written across his face. "The second wave is pulling back." I allowed myself one breath of relief before reminding everyone, including myself, that a pause was not a victory. Voskaren was recalculating, and somewhere above us, an empire that had never failed to bring a rebellious colony to heel was trying to understand why this one refused to break. What none of us realized yet was that our stand on Kestrel had already been observed by more than just the Dominion. A passing trade vessel from an unaligned species, one that had learned long ago to stay quiet and uninvolved in matters between larger powers, had witnessed the entire encounter from a safe distance and relayed what they saw across several trade networks before continuing on their route. Word of a small, poorly defended human colony standing against a full Dominion strike force spread quickly among species who had spent generations under Korath rule, watching carefully for any sign that the Empire's grip might one day loosen. For most of them, it was simply an interesting rumor, nothing more. For humanity, once the reports reached Earth through official channels hours later, it became something else entirely. I did not know, standing on the trembling deck of Kestrel, that our fight had already begun to matter beyond the walls of our small station. All I knew was that Grace needed more time to stabilize the reactor, that Oliver needed backup he did not have, and that somewhere above us, an alien commander was deciding whether embarrassment was worth the cost of finishing what had already cost more than expected. Voskaren made the decision to commit the full weight of the fleet. It was, in hindsight, the mistake that would define everything that followed. When Earth received the first distress signal from Kestrel, it did not arrive as a clear, organized report. It arrived as fragments, pieces of data relayed through emergency channels never meant to carry information across such distance, patched together by exhausted communications officers working through the night to understand what exactly was happening at the edge of colonized space. I was not there to see it, caught up as I was in the fight for our own survival, but I later learned that the response across Earth was immediate, and it was not what the Korath Dominion, or any of the older powers watching from a distance, expected. There was no panic, no desperate scrambling for negotiation, no offers of surrender sent ahead of any real understanding of what had actually occurred. Within hours, factories that had spent years producing civilian goods began shifting their lines toward military production, guided by contingency plans drafted decades earlier and never fully expected to be used. Veterans who had left service years before found themselves called back, not through mandatory conscription, but through a flood of volunteers who saw the reports from Kestrel and decided, without needing to be asked twice, that this was a fight they intended to be part of. Research facilities that had spent years developing technology for peaceful purposes turned their attention overnight toward defense. Engineers working through exhaustion because the alternative, waiting quietly for an empire to decide our fate, was simply not something humanity as a whole was willing to accept. It was, to any outside observer studying the situation with proper attention, a terrifying thing to witness. Not because of the speed of it, though the speed alone would have unsettled any calculation the Dominion had prepared. It was terrifying because of the coordination behind it, an entire species moving toward a single purpose without needing a central authority to force the transformation. It happened because enough individual people, in enough individual places, decided at roughly the same moment that this was worth doing. Admiral Louise Caro, commanding officer of Earth's small but growing defense fleet, addressed the newly assembled task force from the deck of the flagship, a vessel named the Halcyon, built originally for deep space exploration and hastily reinforced for the conflict ahead. "We are not the largest fleet in this galaxy," she said, her voice carried through every ship under her command. "We are not the most advanced. What we are is a species that has never, in its entire history, simply accepted being told what it is allowed to become. That has not changed today, and it will not change tomorrow." I heard a recording of that speech days later, once I had been pulled from Kestrel for medical treatment and reassignment, and even through the crackle of transmitted audio, I felt something in it that steadied me more than any medical treatment could. While Earth mobilized, diplomatic channels attempted, quietly and without much hope, to reach out to the wider galactic community, not to beg for intervention, but to make clear what was actually happening. Ambassadors from smaller allied species, ones who had interacted with humanity long enough to understand us better than the Dominion ever had, tried repeatedly to warn Korath leadership that continuing this conflict would not end the way their strategic models predicted. Those warnings were dismissed, the same way the ancient inscription buried in forgotten ruins had been dismissed for generations. Superstition, exaggeration, the kind of thing older, wiser species were too sophisticated to take seriously. I met one of those ambassadors myself during my recovery, a diplomat from a species called the Yerinth, small in stature but sharp in every other sense, who had spent decades studying humanity out of what she once described to me as professional fascination. "They think you are unpredictable because you break the patterns they expect," she told me, sitting beside my recovery bed in a research station far from the front lines. "What they fail to understand is that you are not actually unpredictable. You are simply consistent in a way they have never bothered to study properly." "Consistent how?" I asked. "You remember," she said simply, "every loss, every sacrifice, every moment your people have ever endured. You remember it, and you carry it forward into whatever comes next. That is not chaos, Commander Hart. That is the most dangerous kind of order there is." I thought of Grace, working through exhaustion to keep Kestrel standing. I thought of Oliver, refusing to leave his post even as fatigue nearly broke him. I thought of every name I would later learn had joined the growing defense fleet, drawn not by orders but by the simple, unshakable refusal to let this stand unanswered. The ambassador was right, though it would take the Korath Dominion far longer to understand it than it should have. As Earth's fleet grew, so did its alliances. Species who had lived for generations under Dominion rule, quietly resentful but too weak individually to resist, began reaching out through unofficial channels, offering resources, intelligence, and in some cases volunteers, willing to fight alongside a species most of the galaxy still considered impossibly young. Among them was a small group of independent traders and former Dominion enforcers who had grown disillusioned with the Empire's methods, led by a woman named Priya Okafor, who had spent years operating just outside Dominion jurisdiction and had no love left for the Empire that once employed her. "I've seen what they do to worlds that resist properly," she told me, during one of the coordination meetings that brought together humanity's growing coalition of allies. "I have never seen them face something that refuses to resist properly and simply keeps existing anyway. It terrifies them more than any weapon could." I began to understand, in those weeks of preparation, that humanity's advantage had never been about matching the Dominion's strength directly. It was about refusing to fight the war on their terms at all. While Korath doctrine relied on overwhelming force applied efficiently and predictably, humanity thrived in exactly the kind of chaos that made their calculations meaningless. Grace, recovered from her injuries and reassigned to the growing engineering corps supporting the fleet, spent long nights developing modifications to existing technology, blending human ingenuity with insights shared by our new allies. Oliver, promoted to lead a team of tactical analysts, studied every recorded engagement from Kestrel and beyond, searching for patterns the Dominion had not yet learned to expect. I was given command of a task force built from volunteers, veterans, and allied crews, tasked with a mission that felt, at the time, almost impossibly large in scope. Not simply to defend the next colony the Dominion targeted, but to ensure that when the full weight of their fleet finally arrived, they would find something far different from the disorganized, easily conquered species they still believed us to be. The final diplomatic attempt came weeks later, when representatives from Earth met with Dominion officials in neutral territory, hoping, despite everything, that war might still be avoided. I was present at that meeting, not as a negotiator, but as an observer requested by Admiral Caro herself, given my experience at Kestrel. The Dominion representative, a high-ranking official named Threl Vashon, listened to our terms with visible impatience, dismissing every point raised by our diplomats with the same tone one might use to correct a child overstepping their understanding of the world. "Your species has caused an unacceptable disruption," Threl said. "The Dominion is prepared to overlook this, provided full compliance is offered immediately, along with reparations for the losses incurred during the incident at your mining colony." "The incident," Admiral Caro replied evenly, "was your fleet attacking a civilian outpost without provocation. The outpost refused lawful annexation," Threl said, as if the distinction settled the matter entirely. I watched the exchange continue for nearly an hour, watched every attempt at reasonable compromise met with the same rigid insistence that humanity simply accept its place within an order it had never agreed to join. By the end of it, it was clear to everyone present that the Dominion had no intention of stepping back from the path they had already chosen. As the meeting ended, Threl turned to Admiral Caro with something close to genuine curiosity. "Your species continues to resist an outcome that is, by every measure we possess, inevitable. Why?" Admiral Caro held his gaze without hesitation. "Because inevitability is not the same thing as acceptance," she said. "You have spent your entire existence conquering species who eventually decided resistance was pointless. We have not, and we will not. If your empire wants to test whether that difference matters, we won't stop you. But you should know that every civilization that has ever tried to teach humanity our place has eventually needed to learn ours instead." Threl said nothing further, and the meeting ended without agreement. Within days, reconnaissance reports confirmed what everyone had quietly expected. The Dominion was assembling its main battle fleet, a force far larger and more advanced than anything sent to Kestrel, intending to end humanity's defiance permanently and restore, in their eyes, the natural order that had briefly and inexplicably been disturbed. In the weeks before the Dominion's main fleet arrived, I traveled between training grounds scattered across 3 colonies, meeting the volunteers who would eventually serve under my command. Most of them had never fought in anything resembling a war. There were teachers among them, agricultural workers from the outer settlements, retired pilots who had spent the last decade flying supply routes rather than combat missions. None of them looked, on paper, like the kind of force capable of standing against an empire that had subdued entire star systems without needing more than a handful of engagements. I remember one volunteer in particular, a young woman named Claire Dunmore, who had worked as a schoolteacher on one of the inner colonies before the reports from Kestrel reached her classroom. She approached me after a training session, still unsteady on her feet from hours of drills she had never expected to need. "I keep asking myself if I'm actually capable of this," she admitted. "I taught children how to read, Commander. I don't know the first thing about combat." "None of us knew the first thing about this, not really," I told her. "Not before Kestrel. What matters isn't whether you already know how to do this, it's whether you're willing to learn fast enough to matter when it counts." She nodded, though I could see the doubt still sitting behind her eyes, the same doubt I saw reflected in nearly every volunteer during those early weeks. It would not fully disappear until the battle itself forced it to, the way fear so often does when there is simply no room left for anything else. Grace, meanwhile, had assembled a team of engineers, drawn from every colony willing to send them, working around the clock to adapt existing technology into something capable of standing against Dominion weaponry. She showed me the modifications personally one evening, walking me through systems that had once been used for asteroid mining, now repurposed into something closer to genuine defense. "It's not elegant," she admitted, gesturing toward a bank of modified shield generators. "But elegant was never going to save us. Effective might. Will it hold against their flagship-class vessels? Against a direct assault, probably not for long," she said honestly. "But that's not the plan, is it?" It wasn't. Oliver's analysis of the Kestrel engagement had revealed something crucial about Dominion strategy, a reliance on overwhelming coordinated force that depended entirely on their opponent fighting in a similarly organized, predictable fashion. Break that predictability, and their advantage narrowed considerably, even if their raw firepower remained far greater than ours. Priya Okafor's contribution proved just as vital during those preparation weeks. Having served within Dominion ranks for years before her disillusionment, she understood their command structure intimately, the rigid hierarchy that made their fleet so effective in conventional engagements and so vulnerable to disruption. "Their commanders do not improvise well," she explained during one strategy session, gesturing toward a holographic display of typical Dominion fleet formations. "Every officer below flagship command defers almost entirely to central authority. Remove that authority, even temporarily, and you create confusion that takes them precious minutes to resolve." "Minutes we can use," I said. "Minutes that might be the only advantage you have," she confirmed. The Uranth ambassador, whose name I eventually learned was Sela Marn, continued advising Earth's diplomatic efforts throughout this period, though she made clear from the beginning that her hope was for a resolution that would not require the battle we were preparing for. "I have studied your species for most of my career," she told me during one of our last conversations before the Dominion fleet's arrival. "I did not expect to see this conflict resolved through combat. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that reason might prevail before it came to that." "Reason requires both sides to be willing to listen," I said. "The Dominion has shown us they aren't." "No," she agreed quietly. "They have not. I only hope that whatever happens next does not cost you more than it already has." It was a hope I carried with me in the final days before the battle at Hollis, watching Claire Dunmore and volunteers like her train harder than I had believed possible in the time available, watching Grace's modifications pass every test we could devise, watching Oliver refine strategies built on every lesson Kestrel had taught us. I stood on the deck of my assigned command vessel, the Meridian, watching final preparations unfold around me, and thought of the ancient warning once again: "Do not provoke the ones who bury their dead and still remember them." The Dominion had already provoked us. Now they were about to discover exactly what that memory was capable of becoming. The Dominion fleet arrived at the edge of the Hollis system 3 weeks later, a formation so vast that our sensors struggled to render it accurately at first, mistaking the sheer number of vessels for interference. I stood on the bridge of the Meridian, watching the true scale of it resolve on the display, and felt the weight of it settle over every person on that deck. Grace's voice came through my headset from the engineering deck below. "Whatever we're about to do, Commander, I hope it's clever, because it certainly isn't going to be fair." "It was never going to be fair," I said. "We just need it to be enough." Our strategy had been built over weeks of preparation, shaped by everything we had learned from Kestrel and refined by insights from our allies. The Dominion fought with precision, coordinated waves of overwhelming force, meant to break resistance quickly and completely. They did not fight well against confusion, against tactics that shifted mid-engagement, against an enemy willing to take losses that a purely logical calculation would say were not worth the gain. So we gave them exactly that. The first phase of the battle unfolded exactly as Oliver's analysis had predicted. Dominion strike craft advanced in tight, disciplined formations, expecting our fleet to meet them with a similarly organized front. Instead, our ships scattered deliberately, breaking into smaller, independent groups that struck from unexpected angles, retreated before serious damage could be dealt, and reformed elsewhere before Dominion sensors could properly track the pattern. Voss Karen, commanding the main assault from the Dominion flagship, watched the chaos unfold with mounting frustration. Every calculation insisted that a fleet fighting without clear central coordination should collapse into disorganized panic within minutes. Instead, our forces adapted continuously, each smaller group making independent decisions that somehow still served the larger strategy. A kind of coordination that did not rely on constant central command the way Dominion doctrine demanded. "They fight like a swarm," Voss said to a subordinate officer, watching another strike formation break apart under an unexpected counterattack. No central logic, and yet no true chaos either. What Voss did not yet understand, and would not fully understand until it was far too late, was that humanity's coordination came not from central command, but from shared purpose. Every pilot, every engineer, every soldier in that fleet understood exactly what they were fighting for, and that understanding allowed them to make decisions in the moment that no algorithm could have predicted, because the decisions were not built on logic alone. They were built on the simple, unshakable will to protect what mattered. 3 hours into the engagement, the battle turned in a direction the Dominion had not prepared for. Priya Okafor's allied ships, familiar with Dominion tactics from years of prior service, began exploiting weaknesses in their formation that only someone who had once fought for the Empire could recognize. Combined with Grace's modified weapon systems, capable of disrupting Dominion shielding in ways their engineers had never encountered, our smaller fleet began inflicting damage disproportionate to its size. I coordinated the Meridian and a cluster of support vessels toward the Dominion's secondary command ship, a target chosen specifically because its destruction would fracture their communication network without requiring a direct assault on their heavily defended flagship. It was a calculated risk, one that required drawing enemy attention away from more vulnerable sections of our fleet. It worked, but not without cost. Grace's voice came through again, tighter this time, strained with something beyond exhaustion. "Commander, the Amara took a direct hit. Their shields are gone." The Amara was one of our support vessels, commanded by a young officer named Ethan Lowry, someone I had trained personally during the early weeks of the mobilization. I watched on the display as the ship, already damaged from earlier engagements, took another strike meant for the Meridian, a deliberate choice made in the seconds before impact to place itself between us and incoming fire. "Get them out," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "There's no time," Oliver replied quietly. "They already made their choice, Commander." Claire Dunmore, the former schoolteacher who had once doubted whether she belonged among us, was piloting one of the smaller support craft assigned to protect the Amara's flank. I heard her voice over the comm in the moments after the strike, steady in a way that surprised even me. "Commander, the Amara's crew got 2 escape pods out before the hit," she reported. "I'm moving to recover them now." "Do it," I said, watching her small craft break formation to retrieve the survivors, exposed and vulnerable in the open space between the two fleets. It was exactly the kind of decision Dominion doctrine would have flagged as an unacceptable risk. A single vessel abandoning its assigned position to save 2 escape pods when the greater battle still hung in the balance. She did it anyway, and she succeeded, pulling both pods into her hold and rejoining the formation moments before a second wave of strike craft could close the gap she had created. I watched the Amara's signal fade from our sensors and felt something in my chest tighten in a way no training could have prepared me for. There was no time to grieve properly in the middle of a battle still unfolding around us, and so I did what every commander before me had needed to do in that same terrible moment. I carried it forward, let it settle into the same place every other loss in humanity's long history had settled, and used it to sharpen my focus rather than dull it. Ethan Lowry's sacrifice was not wasted. The opening created by the Amara's destruction allowed our remaining ships to strike the Dominion's secondary command vessel directly, disabling its communication array and throwing their coordinated assault into temporary disarray. Voss Karen, watching the sudden breakdown in fleet communication, finally understood what every strategic model had failed to account for. This was not a battle humanity intended to win through matching strength. It was a battle we intended to win by refusing to stop, no matter what the cost, until the fight itself became more expensive than the Empire was willing to pay. "Order the flagship to engage directly," Voss commanded, abandoning the careful, calculated approach that had guided Dominion conquest for centuries. "End this now." The Dominion flagship advanced, a vessel larger and more powerful than anything humanity had ever built, weapons capable of ending our entire fleet in a single coordinated strike. I watched it approach on the display, felt the fear that came with facing something so clearly beyond our strength, and made the only decision that felt right in that moment. "All ships," I said, opening a channel to the entire fleet, "converge on the flagship. Every weapon we have, everything we've learned, everything we've lost to get here, we end this together, or not at all." What followed was not a battle fought with careful strategy. It was fought with everything humanity had carried forward through every generation of conflict and recovery, every innovation born from desperation, every soldier willing to risk everything because giving up was simply not part of who we were. Our fleet converged, weapons firing in overlapping patterns designed to overwhelm the flagship's shielding faster than it could adapt. Grace's modifications, tested under the worst possible conditions, began disrupting Dominion systems in ways their engineers had never encountered. Oliver's tactical analysis, refined through weeks of studying every previous engagement, guided our approach with a precision that matched, and in some moments exceeded, the Dominion's own calculated efficiency. Voss Karen watched the flagship's shields begin to fail, watched systems flicker and fail under an assault that should not have been possible from a fleet this size, and felt, for the first time in a long career built on certainty, genuine uncertainty about the outcome. "Belay that order," Voss finally said, voice tight with something that had not existed in Dominion command in living memory. "Signal a ceasefire." The battle ended not with the destruction of the Dominion flagship, but with its surrender, a result far more significant than victory through force alone. It meant that even the most powerful vessel in their arsenal, faced with a species willing to risk everything and coordinate through shared purpose rather than central command, had no path forward that did not end in unacceptable loss. I stood on the bridge of the Meridian as the ceasefire was confirmed, watching the wreckage of the battle drift silently across the display, and thought of Ethan Lowry and every other name that would be added to the long list of those we carried forward rather than simply lost. Grace's voice came through the comm one final time, quieter than before. "We did it, Commander." "No," I said, watching the Dominion flagship power down its remaining weapons in surrender. "They did it to themselves. We just refused to stop reminding them why that was never going to work." Far above the wreckage of the battle, in the quiet after the ceasefire, Voss Karen finally accessed the full translation of the ancient inscription that had been dismissed as superstition for so long, reading it not as a curiosity, but as a warning understood at last, far too late to have mattered. The peace talks took place 3 weeks after the battle at Hollis, held aboard a neutral station chosen by representatives from several species who had, for the first time in generations, begun to imagine a galaxy where the Dominion's word was no longer absolute law. I attended alongside Admiral Caro, Grace, and Oliver, representing Earth not as conquerors, but as a species finally being taken seriously by a community that had spent decades underestimating us. Threll Vashon, the same Dominion official who had once dismissed our terms with such certainty, sat across from us now with a very different posture, one shaped by the loss of a flagship and the surrender of a commander whose career had, until Hollis, never known genuine defeat. "Your species continues to defy explanation," Threll said, his voice quieter than I remembered from our previous meeting. "Our analysts have spent weeks attempting to understand how a fleet built from volunteers and improvised technology managed to defeat a force so clearly superior in every measurable way." "I could explain it," I said, "but I don't think the explanation is something your analysts are going to find comfortable." "Try me," Threll said. I thought of Ethan Lowry, of Grace working through exhaustion to keep our systems alive, of Oliver refusing to leave his post even when fatigue threatened to break him entirely. I thought of every ordinary person on Kestrel who had become something extraordinary the moment they were given no other choice. You measure strength in numbers, I said. Ships, weapons, resources. We measure it in what we're willing to remember and carry forward. Every loss we've ever suffered becomes part of who we are, not something we leave behind. That's not a weakness your fleet could exploit, because it isn't built on anything that breaks under pressure. It's built on the exact opposite. Pressure is what makes it stronger. Threll considered this for a long moment before responding. The ancient warning, he said finally, spoke of a species that remembers its dead. We assumed this meant simple sentiment, emotional weakness that could be exploited through overwhelming force. It's not weakness, Admiral Caro said. It's the reason we never stop, even when stopping would be the reasonable choice. Every person we've lost becomes a reason to keep going, not a reason to surrender. The negotiations that followed were unlike any the Dominion had conducted in living memory. Rather than dictating terms to a conquered people, they found themselves negotiating as equals with a species they had underestimated at every turn. Humanity did not demand reparations disproportionate to the harm caused, nor did we seek to establish an empire of our own in the aftermath of victory. Instead, we asked for something the Dominion had rarely been asked to offer before. Recognition, not of superiority, but of equal standing among the galaxy's older powers. You could have demanded far more, Threll said, near the end of the final negotiating session, genuine confusion evident in his tone. Your victory at Hollis would have justified significant expansion of your territory, resources beyond what you currently possess. We didn't fight this war to become another empire, I said. We fought it because we were told our right to exist was something that could be negotiated away by force. All we want is for that to never be true again, for us or for anyone else your empire has treated the same way. It was Grace, standing beside me during that final session, who added the point that would end up shaping the terms of peace more than any other. You built an empire on the assumption that resistance always fades eventually, she said. Maybe for most species it does, but every world you've conquered, every people you've absorbed into your systems, they're still out there, still remembering what was taken from them. We're not the only ones capable of carrying that forward. We were simply the first ones with the will to prove it. The silence that followed lasted longer than any pause in the negotiations before it. In the months that followed the treaty's signing, the wider galactic community began to shift in ways nobody, least of all the Dominion, had fully anticipated. Species who had lived for generations under Korath rule, quiet and resigned, found new courage in the example humanity had set, not through violence or open rebellion in most cases, but through renewed demands for fair treatment, backed now by the knowledge that resistance was not always the futile gesture the Dominion had spent centuries convincing everyone it would be. Priya Okafor's group of independent allies became the foundation of a growing network of species and individuals who no longer accepted the old order as permanent, inspired by what they had witnessed at Hollis and unwilling to simply return to how things had been before. I returned to Kestrel once, several months after the treaty was finalized, to oversee the station's rebuilding alongside Grace and Oliver, both of whom had chosen to stay with the project rather than return to the growing defense fleet full-time. Standing in the same command deck where this entire conflict had begun, I found it strange to think of how much had changed since that first alarm had pulled me from sleep. "Do you think they understand it now?" Grace asked, standing beside me as new construction crews worked to repair the damage still visible along the station's outer hull. "The Dominion, I mean, the actual warning. I think Voss understands it," I said. "I think Threll is starting to. Whether the rest of their empire ever will, that's a different question." "And if they don't?" Oliver asked. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the stars beyond the station's viewport, endless and patient, the way they had always been, long before humanity ever ventured out among them. "Then I suppose the warning gets rewritten again," I said. "Every generation that forgets it seems to need a new reminder." Word of what happened at Hollis spread slowly through the wider galaxy over the following year, shared not through official Dominion channels, which remained reluctant to fully acknowledge the scope of their defeat, but through the growing network of allied species who had witnessed it firsthand. The ancient inscription, once dismissed as an obscure curiosity from a forgotten era, began appearing in new translations, studied more seriously now by scholars who finally understood why it had endured so long after the species who first carved it had vanished. Some historians began to wonder whether that first species had faced humanity themselves long before recorded history, and had simply left behind the only warning they could manage before disappearing entirely. Others believed the warning had never been about humanity specifically, but about any species capable of carrying grief and memory forward as fuel rather than burden, a pattern the Dominion had simply been unfortunate enough to test against us first. I never learned which explanation was true, and I suspect the answer may never be fully known. What I did learn, standing in the quiet aftermath of a war none of us had wanted, but all of us had been ready to finish, was that some warnings exist, not because the danger they describe is unique, but because it is universal, waiting patiently across the ages for whoever is foolish enough to test it next. Voss Karen resigned from Dominion Command within the year, unable to reconcile a career built on certainty with a defeat that had reshaped everything the Empire once believed about its place in the galaxy. In a rare private message sent to me shortly before stepping down, Voss offered something I had not expected from an enemy commander. "I read the full warning many times since Hollis," the message said. "I understand now that it was never a threat meant to provoke fear alone. It was meant as respect, offered by whoever first encountered your kind, to whoever might be arrogant enough to forget it. I was arrogant. I hope whoever reads this after me is wiser than I was." I kept that message, filed among the records of everything Kestrel and Hollis had cost us, a reminder that even those who had once stood against us were capable of understanding, eventually, what should have been clear from the beginning. Grace continued her work rebuilding not just Kestrel, but stations across the newly secured border, applying lessons learned in crisis to strengthen colonies that had once been as vulnerable as we were. Oliver moved into a role advising the growing coalition of allied species, helping them understand tactics and strategies that had once seemed impossible against an empire as established as the Dominion. As for myself, I remained in service, not because the war had ended, but because peace, I had come to understand, required just as much vigilance as conflict ever had. The galaxy was larger than the Dominion alone, and somewhere among the countless stars still unexplored, other powers existed who had likely heard the same ancient warning and dismissed it the same way, certain that whatever came before did not apply to them. I do not know if humanity will ever be tested this way again. I suspect we will be, eventually, because there will always be those who look at what we have built and see only the surface, mistaking our diversity for weakness and our history of conflict for proof of instability, rather than proof of exactly the opposite. If that day comes, whoever they are, wherever they come from, I hope they take the time to read the warning properly before deciding we are worth the cost of testing. Because if they do not, they will learn, the same way the Dominion learned at Hollis, that humanity does not measure its strength in ships, or weapons, or territory. We measure it in memory, in the names we carry forward, and in the simple, unshakable refusal to ever stop being exactly who we are, no matter what the galaxy decides to throw against us next. The warning was never meant to frighten anyone into obedience. It was meant as the truest kindness one civilization could offer another before making the same mistake themselves. Some of us finally understood that. I hope, for the sake of whoever comes next, that understanding spreads further than the Dominion ever allowed it to before Hollis forced their hand. Claire Dunmore returned to teaching eventually, though not in the way she had before Kestrel. She now traveled between colonies, sharing what she had learned during the war, not lessons of combat, but lessons of what ordinary people become capable of when everything they care about is placed at risk. I visited one of her classrooms during a diplomatic tour some months after the treaty was signed, and watched her explain the events at Hollis to a room full of children too young to fully understand what had been at stake. Why didn't we just give them what they wanted? One child asked her, the same question I imagine many across the galaxy had asked in the aftermath. Wouldn't it have been safer? Claire considered the question carefully before answering, the same patience she had shown me during those early training sessions still present in every word. Sometimes safety isn't really safety at all, she said. Sometimes it's just surrender wearing a different name. We didn't fight because it was safe. We fought because giving up what we believed in would have cost us something we could never get back, no matter how safe it looked from the outside. I thought about that answer often in the months that followed, standing at diplomatic gatherings where humanity was, for the first time, treated as an equal participant rather than a curiosity to be studied or a threat to be contained. Selamarn remained an important voice in those gatherings, working tirelessly to ensure that the lessons of Hollis were not forgotten or diminished as time passed and the immediate danger faded from memory. She once told me, during a quiet moment between negotiations, that she believed humanity's greatest contribution to the wider galaxy might not be our strength in battle at all, but the example we had set for other species who had spent generations believing resistance was pointless. You proved that memory does not have to be a burden, she said. You proved it can be a foundation instead. I believe that lesson will outlast every treaty signed in its aftermath. I hoped she was right. I still do. The last time I stood on the bridge of the Meridian before my eventual reassignment to advisory duties, I found myself thinking not of the battle at Hollis, nor even of the losses that still weighed on me more than I ever let show, but of the simple, quiet moment on Kestrel's command deck when this entire journey began. A young engineer and a nervous systems officer standing beside a commander who had no idea, in that moment, just how far this fight would eventually carry all of us. We did not choose this war. It was brought to our door by an empire that mistook our history for weakness and our diversity for disorder. But once it arrived, we did not waste a single moment wondering whether we were capable of answering it. That, I have come to believe, was the truest meaning behind the ancient warning all along. Not a threat of destruction waiting to be unleashed, but a simple truth that any civilization willing to look closely enough could have understood from the very beginning. Humanity does not need to be the strongest power in the galaxy to be the one you should never underestimate. We only need to remember, and we always will, because the stars are patient, and so are we, and some warnings are worth listening to the first time they are given.